Hey, how's it going? Today we're going to talk about how you can combine a NestJS application with a React.js application into a single monorepo. Imagine that you're trying to create a full stack application, JavaScript or TypeScript, both on the front end and the back end. You know you want to use React.js on the front end. Now, most people that have this use case probably should just consider Next.js, which is a pretty good meta framework for React, and it also serves as basically somewhat of a backend framework that allows you to do your own API routes. You can do server-side rendering, static site generation. Now, however, you might be thinking, where does Nest.js come in? If we're already using Next.js for the full stack, well, let's quickly take a look at what Next.js offers out of the box in terms of a backend framework. So they have this concept called API routes, which is almost very similar to what you might see from something like Express, which means that, by design, it's pretty minimal and it kind of asks you to figure out the rest of the architecture for yourself. For example, perhaps you're trying to do GraphQL. They have a link here for how to do that with GraphQL Yoga, but it doesn't tell you really how. It just shows you an example. Whereas if you compare this with the Next.js documentation, you can see that they have GraphQL as a first-class thing that they support. Now, GraphQL is just one thing, right? But there's also things like how do you do authentication, authorization, how do you connect to databases, how do you do Swagger docs if you're using REST, or perhaps WebSockets and a bunch of other things like event-driven architectures. There's a lot of things in Nest.js that you can do out of the box. It has first-class support for a lot of these things that Next.js will, basically tell you, hey, figure it out on your own. So that's where I can see the use case of people selecting Nest.js as their primary backend framework because of all these things that it basically out of the box supports. Now, if you did decide to use Nest for your backend framework, that means that you kind of have to split up your application into effectively two applications, right? Where you have Nest.js in the backend, Next.js in the front end, which this totally could be a valid combination. However, since both of these are technically server frameworks, right, that means that you likely are going to have to spin up two different servers to make your application run, which could be fine for you, but for others, maybe not so much. One thing to think about though is if perhaps you don't need server-side rendering or static site generation, you probably could just get away with doing a single page application, right? Like basically React on its own, and then just have your Next.js application serve that up in production. And this is exactly the use case that I do want to cover in this video. How do we create a monorepo that has both of these things together? You can build your entire project as one running server that effectively has both of these things. So I've got a terminal here open. You can see that I'm using Node 18 and NPM 8. You do need to use one of the newer versions of NPM that supports workspaces, which we need for our monorepo. All right, so to get started, create yourself a directory for your application. I just called mine Nest React. Go into that, and immediately we're going to install a dependency. Let's do npm install -d turbo. And then I'll actually just open this up in VS Code and we'll continue from there. All right, so here's our application. Not much in here yet. You can see the turbo under our dev dependencies here. We are going to add something here in package.json, which is workspaces, which takes in an array, and you can pass in here a path of a pattern where all your workspaces will be. In our case, we're going to put our applications in an apps folder. So on the left side here, I'm going to go ahead and create that new apps folder. Now I'm back in the terminal here to start, creating those new applications. If you're not familiar with Nest, it does come with a CLI that you need to install globally. So if you haven't done that before, do npm install -g at nestjs/CLI at latest. Once you have that installed, we're going to go to the apps folder, and then we'll use that CLI to install a new project. We're going to do nest new API, and then we're going to say we're going to use npm because that's what we started with. You can see that this already installs the packages for you, right? So you can see on the left here, our application is created. We'll get back to this code in a second, but let's also create our client application while we're in the terminal. Now for the React application, I'm going to use Vite. You can just do npm create Vite at latest and then the name of your project. This one I'm just going to call client to keep it simple. And make sure to select React here and TypeScript. Now, one thing to pay attention to here is that it doesn't do the npm install for you, so we're going to do that. So I'm just going to do npm install at the root of our project. You might be wondering, why didn't I do that in the client folder? Well, the way that workspaces works is that basically it'll look at all the individual package.jsons that you have, right? Both in API and also in a client folder, there's a package.json in there. So even if you install at the root, and really you should be installing at the root, it should resolve your dependencies correctly. All right, so at this point, we got two applications. We've got a Nest API and a React client. Now we need to start thinking about how do we work with both of these applications at the same time, right? So for example, when you're developing locally, it would be great if both of them are running at the same time, or perhaps at deploy time, you want to be able to build both of these at the same time, right? So that's where turborepo comes in. It's a tool that helps you basically get a monorepo up and running very quickly. To get started, we're going to create a new file at the root. We're going to call it turbo.json. And I'm going to paste some initial config here that you can feel free to pause the screen and copy. Now, you don't have to fully understand how turborepo works just to get started with it. It can be pretty simple. But you can hover over some of these to get a glimpse of what this is supposed to define. So for example, pipeline is an object that represents the task dependency graph of your project. Within that, you can put in tasks that if Turbo finds a workspace package with an npm script that matches this key, it's basically going to run that across your different applications. So what does that mean? Now, in our client, notice that if we go to the package.json in our client, you can run our application using npm run dev. Let's take a look at API. It also has a package.json that has its own scripts. It also has a dev script, but it's called start dev. We're actually going to simplify this to just be dev so that it's matching. Now, while we're here, I'm actually going to add a flag here, preserve watch output, which basically says that as we change the code, don't clear out the terminal. All right, so at this point, we have an npm script dev for both API and client. And in turborepo, we said that we have this task here called dev. So it's going to look for those npm scripts. So for us to run this task, we're also going to add a script in the root package.json. And I'll also just call this dev to be consistent. And we're going to do turbo run dev. Let's go ahead and go to our terminal and run npm run dev and see what happens. So you can see that effectively we ran turbo run dev, which says that it goes into this configuration that we had. And it says we have a task called dev. And what that's going to do is go into the individual applications that we have, look at their package.json and run the dev commands for each one of them because it matches the same key that we have here. Right, so you can see that now both of our applications are running. We can check this real quick. So our React application is running under localhost 5173. So on the browser, it should look like this. And then our Nest application is actually by default running on localhost 3000. So if we make that request there, you should just see a hello world, right? So that just proves that, they're running together. And also that's again, why we added the preserve watch output earlier so that you can see all of these logs and it's not being cleared out by Nest. Now it's important to quickly explain how our local development setup differs from our production setup when we actually deploy our application together. So what we effectively have is two different servers running side by side, right? So you can imagine that we're really running Webpack, which serves NestJS. And then for the client side, we have Vite, which is, serving up our React application. And both of these guys are waiting for code changes and will automatically refresh the application. However, in our production environment, that's not how it works, right? We will have a single server. So imagine that we'll have a build for our Nest application and we'll have a build for our React application. And you can imagine that the build of our Nest application is just something that you can run via Node, right? It doesn't need a Webpack server. It just runs on Node. And one of the abilities that we're going to add to it is that it's going to be able to serve up the client build to a browser. And similarly, we have an API that effectively is coming with our Nest application. So our client itself can also make requests to that, right? So I hope that makes sense. I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but that effectively is going to be the end result that we're going to have at the end of this video. Now, quickly, we need to talk about in local development, if we have two separate servers, how do you proxy requests from the client to the server side? For example, if there's a running server here and the client makes a request to /API, how does it know to forward that to our Nest application if they're running in two different servers. Now, luckily, this is actually something that Vite directly supports, so let's go ahead and configure that. And let's take a look at our Vite config. This is the one under apps client. And we're just going to add some server configuration in here that says proxy. If you see this path of /API, make sure to proxy that to localhost 3000, which is our local Nest app. Now that does mean that every request that we are trying to make to our Nest app has to have this base /API. So I'm also going to configure our Nest API to have that base path of /API for all of its routes. So to do that in main.ts, I just need to add app.setGlobalPrefix API. Now, if you're getting a little lost on what I'm trying to do here, go ahead and run your application and let's do a quick demo. Previously on localhost 3000, we got back the hello world because, that's just where it ran by default at the default slash. So if I refresh this, it's actually now going to be a 404 because we said that the global prefix is now /API. So you have to go to /API on localhost 3000 to get back that response. Now, what we're going to do on the React application is we're going to do a request to that /API so that we get back that hello world greeting. All right, so this time let's move over to the client side React application. Let's go to the app.tsx, which is showing that thing you see in the browser earlier with the React and Vite logo. I'm just going to clean this up and remove these things. And then we're going to display our greeting in here. So imagine that we have a greeting state. Let's go ahead and update this useState up here to greeting, set greeting. And then we're just going to add a simple use effect here that is going to make a call to /API, which we said is going to proxy to our Nest API. And then we're just going to get the text from that and then set the greeting from that response, right? So we expect that to be hello world, and then make sure to import use effect, by the way, if you haven't already. I made a small typo actually here. There shouldn't be an extra curly brace here. I'm thinking of handlebars there for some reason. So what effectively is going to happen when this application mounts, right? It's going to make a call to /API. It's going to get a greeting. It's going to save the greeting, and it's going to display it over here. So let's take a look. So now at this point, if you're following along, your React application should be saying hello world, right? And remember, that's coming straight from our Nest API. So we know that the proxy is happening. Now, in production, it doesn't need to do any proxying, right? Because it's just making the request directly to the same server, so you don't have to worry about it. So this is really just a proxy for local development. All right, so at this point, imagine, you're done with your development. Maybe you're ready to deploy a new feature. We need to think about how do we build both of our applications together. And similarly to how we ran both of our applications together for dev, you can also build both of your applications at the same time. So in our turbo.json, we're going to add a build key here in our pipeline. And similarly, kind of like how we have an npm script dev for both of our applications, we already should have a build npm script for our API. If you look in API package.json, there should already be a build script here. And if you look in our client package.json, there should also be a build here that's using TSC and Vite build. Now we do have to add a couple extra pieces of configuration here. We're going to add depends on and outputs. Outputs is pretty simple. Basically, when both of our application builds, there's going to be a dist directory in both of those applications. So this is actually a relative path to each of our applications. So when you build the Nest and when you build the React, they both have a dist folder in there. So we're just letting turborepo know where that is. And then depends on is basically just it's starting to build a dependency graph. When you npm run build, what does this depend on? You can list other things in here. For example, perhaps you have your build depending on tests or linting, right? If you have npm scripts set up for those, it's basically going to run those things before it runs the build. In our case here, when we have this, caret and build, if you hover over this, it'll say that the symbol tells Turbo that this pipeline task depends on the package's, upstream dependencies. So basically, it's saying that It needs to build the dependencies and dev dependencies and make sure those builds for those things are built before building the application itself. I know that's super kind of complicated. There are some extra documentation on this in the Turbo site itself if you want to read about it. But for now, feel free to just follow along. This is really the only configuration you need. All right, so for us to test this configuration, this task, if you remember in the root package.json, we added a dev script there to basically invoke that task. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to add a build and do turbo run build. And we can run this on the terminal to test this out. And again, remember that what this is going to do is basically call npm run build in all of our applications. So in our client and our API. So you can see that it actually will try to build both of them in parallel. And then we didn't talk about this yet, but you can see that there's some caching happening here. Take a look at what happens when I run build again. It'll say that it's already cached. It doesn't have to rebuild. It just did it in 50 milliseconds. It'll know that if the code didn't change, it'll just reuse, the build that it made for you before. And that's also why for dev, our dev script, we said cache false because it doesn't really provide us any benefits, because we know that the build for the dev is going to change often, right? Because we're changing the code. So caching doesn't really make sense there, but for build, it does. And if you just want to prove that both of our applications built, right? If you go on apps, you should expect to see a dist folder within API right here. And there should also be a dist folder within client. And that's why we said that the outputs is in dist. And that's some part of the way that the caching works, is it looks at the outputs and knows to reuse what we built before. All right, so at this point, we know how to create our builds. You can do it in parallel with a single command. There's one missing piece that we have, which is, remember, we have these separate builds for the React and the NestJS application, but we said that in production, the Nest application is going to serve up our client build to the browser. That way we still only have one single server running in production. Now, if you don't know how to do that, luckily NestJS has support for serving up a static single page application using the serve static module. That we just need to install that as a new package to our application. And then after that, just a little bit of configuration and we'll be done. So back in our application, to install a new package, so remember that we have the apps folder, and each of these apps have their own package.json. You might think that you have to go to each of these folders and run the npm install in there, which you don't. With workspaces, you can just do npm install -- workspace and then define the name of the workspace. In our case, we're trying to install inside API the NestJS serve static package. So I'll hit enter here and install that. So we're going to go to our app module in API. And we're going to add to the imports here. So we added serve static module for root, and then we're going to pass in the path to our client build, right? And also make sure to import that new serve static module. But this path, if you can think about it, is basically, going back twice so that it goes back to apps and then into client and then into dist, where it's going to find this index.html, which it's going to serve up. All right, so at this point, all we need to do is build our application again and then start our API basically in production mode. And if you look at the package.json for API, you can see that they have a start prod script here that basically just does, node run the application on dist main. We're just going to emulate that on the root. So on the root package.json, I'm just going to add a start script here that does node apps API dist main, right? So that's basically the same thing, except it's coming from the root. And then at this point, I think we're basically done with the code. We can go ahead and do npm run build to make sure, it pulls in those changes that we just did with serve static. And then we should be able to do npm start, which is going to spin up our Nest API server in production mode and then serve up our client build. Right, so you can see our application successfully started. And going back to localhost 3000, which is technically our Nest application, right? You can see that it's now serving up our React static build, right? So going back to our drawing here, what's happening is we have a single running Nest server that is serving up this React client build to the browser, right? And we can see that it's still displaying the hello world because it's making that call to just the server itself, bringing us back that hello world response. And there you go. You've got an end-to-end full stack setup for React and NestJS. All right, guys, hopefully that quick monorepo tutorial was very useful to you. Let me know in the comments what you think. Would you do it this way? Would you do it another way? I'd love to know what kind of feedback you have. Also, do make sure to subscribe if you like content like this. I have a lot more planned this year. So make sure to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified. And I'll see you in the next video.